"Don't mind him, he's just a waiter," my daughter-in-law told the wedding guests. "Then they saw me on TV. Welcome to another incredible story. Before we begin, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're tuning in from. It's amazing to see how far these stories reach. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on our next emotional tale." The hall was lit by imposing chandeliers that cast a golden light over the tables, decorated with arrangements of white flowers and scented candles. The sound of clinking glasses mingled with the laughter and lively chatter of the guests. Outside, a light rain drummed against the windows, creating a gentle contrast to the euphoria of the party. Robert, dressed in an impeccable waitress uniform, black vest, starched shirt and bow tie, moved with the precision of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. His posture was erect, his gaze calm and observant, but his steps were almost silent, as if they were part of the luxurious furnishings of the place. He sat between the tables, holding a silver tray on which sat glasses of chilled champagne, each with tiny pearls of bubbles rising to the surface. As he extended a glass to a middle-aged couple, he received a polite but empty smile, typical of someone who sees only an invisible waiter waiting. Robert didn't care. He was used to it. What no one knew was that, behind that uniform, there was a story that could never be guessed. He wasn't bothered by necessity. He was there for something much more personal. In the corner of the room, an orchestra played a soft, almost nostalgic melody that seemed to tell its own stories. As he served, Robert discreetly observed the details, the tension in the eyes of some relatives, the excessive drinking of others, and the way the bride tried to smile even though she was exhausted. His eye was trained to perceive more than others, and perhaps that was why he was so good at business. But that night, no one cared what he saw or thought. To everyone, he was just an older man carrying glasses. At a certain point, he moved away from a group of noisy young people who joked and talked too much for the formal tone of the event. As he bowed slightly to pour the glasses, one of them barely glanced at Robert, as if his presence were irrelevant. The light from the chandeliers reflected off the metal surface of the tray, briefly illuminating the elderly man's serene expression. That face bore deep marks of past experiences, not just wrinkles, but lines that told stories of struggle, hard work, and silent victory. Near the makeshift altar, he saw his daughter-in-law from afar. She was radiant in her dark blue dress, chatting with friends. Her eyes flickered for only a second, but Robert saw a cold flicker there, almost of impatience. It was as if she didn't want him there. That feeling wasn't new. He'd sensed this discomfort coming from her at other functions. Still, he took a deep breath, maintaining the same calm expression. There was no room for confrontation that night. As he circulated, Robert noticed how each guest seemed to be in their own world. Some knew each other through business, others from recent travels. No one wondered who the people serving them were. He knew that for many, waiters were mere figments, part of the scenery. But that never bothered him, because he knew his own worth. If he wanted, he could buy that entire hall, complete with all the furnishings, and still have money left over. However, at that moment, the power he wielded didn't matter. What mattered was fulfilling the promise he'd made to his son, to help cater the wedding. The festive atmosphere continued, laughter, toasts, steps on the dance floor. Amidst all this, Robert remained in the background, invisible to most, but observing every detail. His movements were so calculated that if anyone paid attention, they would realize he was no mere temporary employee. But no one paid attention. To everyone, he was just an older waiter, perhaps even close to retirement. Little did they know that in that same city, his name was emblazoned with million-dollar contracts and business deals, and that, before that night was over, they would never see him the same way again. As Robert approached the elegantly set table, balancing a tray with sparkling champagne glasses, he felt a sudden chill run down his spine. His daughter-in-law, Claire, standing nearby with a smug smile, whispered loudly enough for her friends to hear, "Don't mind him, he's just a waiter." The words hit Robert like a cold gust of wind. He caught every syllable, the cruel dismissal hanging heavy in the air. The room seemed to fall silent for a moment, though no one spoke up against her. It was as if his presence was invisible, and Claire wanted to make sure it stayed that way. Robert's heart tightened, but he forced himself to keep his composure. He was no stranger to harsh words or being overlooked, but this felt different. This was personal. His eyes scanned the guests, some exchanging awkward glances, others pretending not to hear. His son, David, was seated nearby, awkwardly avoiding eye contact, caught between embarrassment and helplessness. The vibrant wedding atmosphere clashed sharply with the sting of humiliation Robert felt. He wondered silently how the woman he had welcomed into his family could treat him with such disdain. He lowered his gaze and continued serving, each step heavier than the last. The uniform he wore wasn't just for show. It was a symbol of his work ethic and dignity. Yet here, in this grand hall filled with laughter and music, he was reduced to a mere stereotype, an invisible servant beneath the sheen of celebration. Robert thought about the years he had sacrificed, the long hours working double shifts, and the silent support he had given to his son's dreams. None of that mattered tonight. To Claire and many others, he was just the waiter. Despite the hurt, Robert found solace in the quiet resilience he had nurtured over decades. He reminded himself that identity was not defined by appearances or fleeting judgments. His worth wasn't measured by a title or the clothes he wore, but by the integrity he held inside. Still, the bitterness lingered. The very people he had worked tirelessly for seemed ready to discard him like yesterday's news. As he passed by Claire's table again, her eyes flashed with smug satisfaction, unaware that beneath his calm exterior, Robert was planning a silent reckoning. As the night wore on, the festivities continued, oblivious to the storm brewing in Robert's mind. He served drinks and smiled politely, but every glance at his family reminded him of the growing distance. His son's hesitation, his daughter-in-law's coldness, even the guests' polite but distant smiles, they all felt like nails in a coffin of shattered respect. Robert wondered if his years of sacrifice had been in vain, and if the family he loved so deeply was slipping away from him forever. Yet somewhere deep within, a spark of hope refused to die out. By the end of the evening, Robert retreated to a quiet corner near the kitchen, away from the glittering chandeliers and lively conversations. He took a deep breath and wiped a tear he didn't want anyone to see. He wasn't ready to give up, not yet. There was more to his story than anyone at that wedding could imagine. And in the shadows of that night, Robert's resolve hardened. He would rise above the scorn, but on his own terms, and when the time was right, everyone would see the man behind the waiter's apron. Robert forced a gentle smile as he poured champagne into a guest's glass, masking the sting of Claire's words. The insult itself didn't pierce him as deeply as the ingratitude did. He had learned long ago not to measure his worth by others' opinions. Yet hearing it from someone he had welcomed into his family still cut deep. He kept his back straight, his movements calm, determined not to let a flicker of emotion betray him in front of the crowd. He thought of the countless times he had gone out of his way to support his son and Claire, paying for their first apartment, helping with bills when David's job was unstable, even giving advice on starting their own ventures. None of it seemed to matter now. In Claire's eyes, he was just a man in a uniform, someone to be tolerated and brushed aside. The thought lodged in his chest like a stone, heavy and unmoving. As he moved from table to table, Robert kept his silence, not because he didn't have a response, but because he knew words spoken in anger rarely built bridges. They burned them, and Robert, for all his pride, still cared about his son's happiness. He wasn't ready to ignite a conflict in the middle of what was supposed to be a joyful family celebration. His restraint, however, came at the cost of swallowing his own hurt. In the kitchen, away from the music and chatter, Robert leaned against the counter for a moment, exhaling slowly. A younger waiter glanced at him, sensing something was wrong, but Robert simply nodded and returned to work. He wasn't there to complain or seek pity. His role tonight was to serve, and he would do it with the same quiet dignity he had carried through every chapter of his life. The irony was almost laughable. Claire saw a man in a vest and bow tie carrying trays and assumed that was the entirety of his existence. What she didn't know, and what Robert didn't feel the need to tell her, was that the catering company providing tonight's service belonged to him. The chefs, the staff, the premium menu, all his. He had chosen to work the event personally, partly as a favor to a friend, partly to stay close to his family. But now he wondered if that had been a mistake. By the time dessert was being served, Robert's pride had morphed into a quiet resolve. He would not defend himself tonight, nor would he reveal the truth to humiliate Claire. The time for that would come naturally, without bitterness, and it would not be for revenge. It would be to remind her, and perhaps even his son, of the value of humility. As he stepped back into the reception hall, the chandeliers casting a golden glow over the crowd, Robert's heart was still heavy, but his steps were steady. In the midst of laughter, music, and celebration, he carried his wounded pride like a shield. He knew who he was, and no careless words could erase that truth. The silence he kept tonight wasn't weakness. It was the patience of a man who understood that life had its own way of revealing the truth in time. Robert was not just a waiter. Beneath the crisp black vest and neatly pressed white shirt, he was the founder and owner of one of the largest restaurant chains in the country. It had taken him decades of long hours, risky investments, and relentless work to build his empire from a single small diner into a nationally recognized brand. Yet he never flaunted it. He preferred to live simply, wearing humility like a second skin. He had started from nothing. No wealthy parents, no connections, no lucky breaks. Just determination, an old pickup truck, and a passion for good food, served with kindness. Every brick in his first restaurant had been paid for with his own hands' labor. Every recipe had been tested until it carried his signature flavor. Even now, when he could afford a life of leisure, Robert chose to stay connected to the work that had shaped him. Claire, his daughter-in-law, had never asked about his past. To her, Robert was quiet and unremarkable, someone who blended into the background. She had no idea of the influence he wielded in the culinary world. Restaurant critics sought his opinion, investors lined up for a meeting, and television networks had featured him on prime-time specials. But in family gatherings, he stayed in the shadows, letting others take the spotlight. This choice puzzled some of his closest friends. Why hide his success? But Robert knew the answer. People treated you differently when they thought you were wealthy. Sometimes with admiration, sometimes with envy, and often with a subtle shift in respect that wasn't real. He preferred relationships that were based on who he was, not on what he owned. That's why, even tonight, he had chosen to work quietly, blending in with the staff. He looked around the wedding hall, the scent of fresh roses mixing with the aroma of the dinner his team had prepared. The menu was a masterpiece. Lobster tails, slow-roasted lamb, artisan bread straight from the oven. Claire had been proud to tell everyone it was the best catering service in the city, never realizing she was praising Robert's own creation. The irony wasn't lost on him. Robert's secret wasn't a burden, it was a shield. By keeping it, he could watch people's true colors without interference. Tonight, he had seen enough to know exactly where he stood with Claire. Her comment had confirmed what he had long suspected. Respect from her would never come, not unless she saw him as someone of status. And that, Robert thought, was her loss, not his. As he refilled a glass of wine for a guest, he caught his own reflection in the mirror behind the bar. A man in his 70s, silver hair neatly combed, posture straight, eyes calm. He saw no shame in that image, only strength, experience, and a story far richer than most people could imagine. Claire could think of him as just a waiter if she wished. It didn't change the truth. Years ago, Robert's life had been very different. He started at the very bottom, washing dishes in the cramped, humid kitchen of a small family-owned bistro. The pay was meager, the hours endless, and the work exhausting. Yet Robert never complained. He watched, he learned, and he absorbed every detail about the restaurant business like a sponge. Every clink of a plate, every order called out from the kitchen, every guest's reaction to a dish taught him something valuable. He wasn't just scrubbing plates, he was studying. He learned how flavors blended, how presentation affected appetite, how the right lighting made customers linger longer. On his lunch breaks, instead of resting, Robert would stand in the doorway to watch the chef work. Over time, the chef noticed his interest and began explaining techniques, letting him taste sauces and even teaching him to season meat properly. Those small lessons planted the seeds of Robert's future. One evening, the bistro owner fell ill, and Robert was asked to help in the kitchen. Nervous but determined, he prepared a simple pasta dish for a late-night customer. That customer turned out to be a well-known food critic. The next day, a glowing review appeared in the local paper, not for the bistro, but specifically for the young man in the kitchen who understands flavor. That article gave Robert his first glimpse of what he could become. With time, he saved enough to buy the struggling bistro when the owners retired. He took risks, introducing new dishes, redecorating the dining area, and hiring friendly, passionate staff. Business slowly improved, then skyrocketed. What had once been a quiet corner cafe became one of the most talked about spots in town. Robert didn't stop there. He opened another and another, each with the same warm service and impeccable food. Eventually, Robert's brand became synonymous with fine dining and heartfelt hospitality. His restaurants were booked months in advance. Celebrities dined there, politicians held meetings there, and tourists sought them out as a must-visit experience. Robert had turned a humble dishwashing job into a multi-million-dollar franchise. Still, he refused to let wealth change him. He continued visiting his restaurants personally, talking to staff, tasting the food, and sometimes even washing dishes for old time's sake. The most remarkable thing was how few people knew the scale of his success. Robert dressed simply, drove an old car, and never flaunted expensive jewelry. He believed wealth should work quietly in the background, funding dreams, not feeding egos. That was why, to strangers and even some family members, he could be mistaken for just a waiter. He didn't mind. He wore humility the way other men wore tailored suits. Standing in the wedding hall now, Robert felt a quiet pride in how far he had come. His hands, once raw from scrubbing pots, now held the power to change lives. But to Claire, none of that mattered, because she had never bothered to ask. And tonight, he was starting to wonder if perhaps she was about to find out the truth, whether she wanted to or not. When Robert's son David called him to discuss the wedding plans, he could hear the excitement in his voice. It wasn't just any wedding, it was David's big day, the day he had been planning for months. As the conversation unfolded, David casually mentioned that the wedding venue had chosen Robert's restaurant for the catering. Robert had no hesitation in agreeing to provide the food for the event. His business had grown to the point where it could handle such requests with ease, and he wanted to help make his son's wedding unforgettable. But then, as the conversation progressed, David made a request that caught Robert off guard. "Dad, I was wondering if you could help with the service too. You know, just for this event. It'll make it extra special having you there. Everyone will be so happy to see you involved." There was a long pause on the line. Robert's heart sank slightly. He had never been asked to do more than provide the food, but now his son wanted him to step into the spotlight. "It'll be a nice touch, Dad," David added, his tone full of hope. Robert had been around long enough to recognize the subtle undercurrent in his son's voice. He had been asked not as a father, but as the owner of a highly successful restaurant. It wasn't just about family, it was about status, image, and presenting the right appearance for a social event of this scale. Still, Robert agreed without hesitation. "Of course, son," he said, his voice steady, though his mind churned with conflicting emotions. It was his son's day, and he would do whatever it took to help. David's excitement was palpable when Robert arrived at the venue on the day of the wedding. He introduced him to the catering team and showed him around, praising the arrangements and calling Robert's presence the icing on the cake. As the evening progressed, Robert moved through the kitchen and the dining area, making sure everything ran smoothly. He gave the chef's advice, checked the presentation of the food, and helped the waitstaff. But as he moved through the room, he felt the eyes of the guests on him. They noticed his calm, professional demeanor. They could sense that he wasn't just a waiter. The more Robert observed, the more he realized that his son's request hadn't been entirely about family pride. David wanted Robert to be involved, yes, but also because it would elevate the event. He wanted to show off subtly that his family came from something successful. Robert couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. He had given everything to his son, but sometimes it seemed that David didn't truly see him as a person, only as a means to an end. Still, Robert held his tongue. Tonight was about David and his new life, not about Robert's feelings. But there was a growing sense of unease within him. Would his son truly understand the depth of what Robert had built? Would he ever see his father as more than the waiter who served at the wedding? Robert shook off the thoughts and kept moving. He had learned long ago that patience and quiet dignity were his strongest tools. Tonight, he would play the role he had been given, even if in the back of his mind he knew it was not the full story. By the time the last course was served, Robert's quiet presence had settled into the evening. He moved with ease, coordinating the staff, ensuring every guest was attended to. Yet as he glanced at David, laughing with his friends at the head table, Robert couldn't help but wonder if this wedding would mark a turning point in their relationship, or if it would be just another moment where Robert's true worth would go unnoticed, hidden behind the apron he wore. Claire had never been fond of Robert's profession. To her, it was a source of embarrassment, a stain on the image of her perfect life. She had married David with the hope of elevating her own status, and to her, having a father-in-law who worked as a waiter was a constant reminder of the blue-collar life she had hoped to leave behind. Every time Robert appeared at a family event, whether in a suit or his uniform, Claire couldn't hide her discomfort. She had grown up in a world where wealth and influence spoke louder than character and hard work. At first, she tried to mask her feelings, but the subtle disdain she felt would sometimes slip through in small ways. She would talk down about the restaurant business, dismissing it as just food and not a real job. She even once joked in front of a few guests, "I'm not sure how I ended up in this family with a man who's still waiting tables at his age. You'd think he'd be retired by now, right?" Robert had laughed it off at the time, but the sting of those words had stayed with him. Claire never realized the impact they had on him. She had no idea that Robert had built the restaurant empire from scratch. Every success, every contract, every accolade he had earned through sheer willpower and determination. To her, he was just a man in a black uniform, carrying drinks and clearing plates. She never bothered to ask about his past, about the countless nights he spent away from home, building his dream. She had no idea that the same man who served her at the wedding had been the one who had turned an ordinary bistro into an award-winning chain of high-end restaurants. As the evening continued, Claire kept up her act, trying to appear as though everything was perfect, just as she always did. But Robert saw through it. He saw the way she looked at him when she thought no one was paying attention. There was a mixture of pity and superiority in her gaze. It was the way she looked at someone she deemed beneath her, someone she could easily ignore because of their social standing. Her words earlier about him being just a waiter echoed in his mind, reminding him of how little she truly understood. Claire, however, remained oblivious to the truth about Robert. She didn't know that he had quietly turned down offers to sell his chain of restaurants for millions. She didn't know that he had resisted pressure to expand, choosing instead to focus on the quality of his business and the well-being of his staff. She didn't know that his success was built on values that were foreign to her: integrity, patience, and respect. To Claire, Robert was just another aging man in an apron, not someone to be taken seriously. Throughout the night, Robert caught glimpses of her, surrounded by her friends, laughing and toasting to the future. He smiled to himself, resigned to the fact that he would always be just a waiter in her eyes. But deep inside, a quiet resolve began to grow. He had spent too many years working for recognition that would never come. And now, he wasn't interested in her approval. He didn't need it. Robert knew his worth, even if Claire never would. As the evening came to a close, Robert continued his work, his heart heavy with the weight of unspoken words. He had come to terms with the fact that he would never be the man Claire wanted him to be. But in the quiet of the night, as he moved through the guests, Robert felt a sense of peace that she would never understand. His life had been built on humility, and no one, not even his own family, could take that away from him. As the night wore on, the guests at the wedding began to notice something unusual. Robert, while moving quietly from table to table, was treated with an unmistakable level of respect by the staff, too much respect for a simple waiter. It wasn't just the way they addressed him, it was the subtle deference in their actions. When Robert entered a room, heads would turn, and the younger servers would almost instinctively adjust their posture. It was clear that they weren't just following instructions, they were honoring someone. But who? A few guests exchanged curious glances, puzzled by the interaction between Robert and the staff. One of the waiters, a tall young man, even stopped to check if Robert needed help with his tray, before nodding respectfully and stepping aside. It wasn't the behavior one would expect from someone who worked in a luxurious venue, especially when the man in question was just a waiter. The polite but subtle exchange felt out of place in the otherwise casual hustle of the wedding. As Robert moved through the crowd, serving drinks and smiling, the guests couldn't help but notice the undercurrent of familiarity between him and the rest of the team. They worked in perfect synchrony, and it was as though they were all on the same wavelength, almost as if they had rehearsed their movements. It was an oddly graceful performance, given that most wedding staff were rushed and often inattentive. But with Robert, everything seemed orchestrated. The team treated him like an equal, not a subordinate. Among the guests was Mr. Jacobs, a regular at Robert's restaurants, who had dined at the finest of his establishments many times. He caught sight of Robert walking past, and something about the way he was treated by the waitstaff sparked a memory. Mr. Jacobs squinted, trying to place the familiarity in Robert's demeanor. He had seen him before, though not in this setting. In an instant, he realized who Robert was, but kept his observation to himself. He knew the face, and the elegance with which Robert conducted himself could not be mistaken. As Robert continued serving, he caught the curious stares of a few guests who had now begun to whisper amongst themselves. "Who is he, really?" one of them asked. "I thought he was just the waiter," another replied, her voice lowered. The speculation lingered in the air, but Robert paid it no mind. His focus remained on ensuring everything went smoothly. He had nothing to prove to these people. His life, his work, and his success were his own to keep, hidden in the background. The subtle exchange of looks and hushed conversations only grew more frequent as the night unfolded. But Robert, ever the professional, never flinched. He had long been used to the whispers, the confusion, and the assumptions people made about him. He had learned that silence was often the best answer to the doubts of others, and so, as he passed through the room, his movements graceful, his expression calm, he remained a man of mystery. The deeper the curiosity grew, the more Robert retreated into the shadows of the evening, content to let the truth simmer quietly. Finally, as the evening came to a close, Claire couldn't ignore the strange behavior of the staff any longer. She glanced at Robert again, noticing the unusual respect in their eyes, and something stirred inside her. She had spent the entire evening dismissing him, assuming he was simply a hired hand, but now doubt began to creep into her mind. Who was this man who commanded such reverence from his staff, and why did she feel like there was more to him than met the eye? Robert continued his work with unwavering focus, moving gracefully between tables, serving each dish with the utmost care. Despite the whispered conversations and the growing curiosity from the guests, he kept his expression neutral, as if nothing was amiss. Every plate he set down, every glass he refilled, was done with the same dedication he had put into building his empire. His hands were steady, his movements practiced, and his mind clear. He wasn't here to seek approval. He was here to do what he had always done: serve with pride. He couldn't help but notice the way the guests would glance at him, their eyes filled with curiosity and quiet judgment. Some looked at him with confusion, others with the faintest hint of skepticism. The whispers grew louder, but Robert paid no mind. He had been through this before, people assuming things about him based on appearances alone. But as the evening wore on, their glances began to shift. There was a sense of unease building, as if they realized they had misjudged him. It was a feeling he had come to know well, the moment when people began to question everything they thought they knew about someone. Claire, still seated at the head of the table, noticed the way the guests looked at Robert. She saw their subtle exchanges, their glances of recognition, but she couldn't place the source of their intrigue. It was unsettling. The man she had dismissed as just a waiter seemed to have a presence that was difficult to ignore. The longer she watched him, the more she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she didn't know, something important. Robert had long ago accepted that people would judge him based on what they saw in front of them. But tonight was different. It wasn't just about the work he did, it was about the life he had built. The years of struggle, sacrifice, and dedication that no one in this room could understand. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He simply knew that his worth had never been tied to what others thought of him. It was a lesson he had learned long ago. People would always form their opinions, but those opinions didn't define him. As the evening continued, the guests' murmurs grew louder, and Robert could feel the shift. The respect he had earned over the years was becoming evident in their eyes, though they had yet to fully comprehend the extent of it. He could see the confusion beginning to fade, replaced by curiosity and finally admiration. But Robert didn't need to be the center of attention. He had built his success quietly, and he was content with letting the truth unfold in its own time. By the time the dessert course was being served, the atmosphere had changed. The whispers had stopped, and a sense of unease lingered in the air. Claire couldn't ignore it any longer. Her eyes followed Robert as he moved through the room, interacting with the staff, always in control, always poised. She felt a sinking feeling in her stomach, as if she had just realized something she had been too proud to see. Was Robert really just a waiter? Or had she missed something far more significant? As the evening drew to a close, Robert quietly retreated to the back of the venue, stepping away from the eyes that had once dismissed him. He had done his part, just as he had always done, without fanfare or need for validation, and now he would wait. The truth, he knew, would reveal itself in time, but tonight he had done what mattered most. He had shown up, and that, more than anything else, was enough. Days after the wedding, photos from the event began to circulate on social media as guests tagged each other in posts and shared memories of the lavish celebration. At first, it seemed like any other wedding photo, with guests laughing, clinking glasses, and dancing under the soft lights of the reception hall. But one photo stood out among the rest. In this one, Robert was captured standing beside a group of renowned chefs, his face unmistakable, receiving a prestigious culinary award at a gala event, his arms raised in triumph. The photo was old, but it had been posted by one of the wedding guests who had recognized Robert from the image. The caption read, "The waiter from the wedding, Turns out he's a famous chef and restaurant mogul. Who knew? The post quickly went viral, shared by hundreds, if not thousands, of people who were suddenly interested in Robert's identity. For the first time, his past was no longer a secret. As Claire scrolled through her feed that evening, she paused at the photo, blinking in disbelief. She couldn't comprehend what she was seeing. That man, just a waiter, the one she had dismissed so easily, was standing beside some of the most respected chefs in the world, and he was being celebrated. The weight of the moment hit her like a ton of bricks. How had she not known? How had she not seen? Her fingers trembled as she clicked on the post, reading the article that came with it. Robert Hughes, the silent powerhouse behind some of the world's finest dining establishments, is known for his humility and dedication to his craft, the article began. Claire's eyes widened as the details of his career unfolded. Multiple Michelin stars, a chain of top-rated restaurants across the country, and a reputation as one of the most influential figures in the culinary world. Her mind raced, replaying the moments from the wedding, the way Robert had been treated by the staff, the subtle respect they had shown him. She had thought it was simply because of his age or seniority, but now she realized he hadn't been a waiter at all. He had been someone far more powerful, someone who had silently built an empire without the need for anyone to know. Claire's stomach churned with a mix of regret and shame. She had treated him as an inferior, and now the truth was painfully clear. As she sat in silence, staring at the screen, she felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. How many times had she made dismissive comments about Robert? How many times had she looked down on him for his job, never once bothering to ask about his life, his success, his story? It was all so clear now. The man who had quietly built an empire had been standing right in front of her, and she had never truly seen him. The realization cut deeper than any insult could have. Claire felt her world shift beneath her, and she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Robert's quiet presence at the wedding had been the only hint of his true identity, and now the truth was out. There was no going back, no undoing the moments of scorn she had directed at him. As she put the phone down, Claire knew that the man she had mocked was now a symbol of everything she had missed: humility, greatness, and the value of true worth. The next morning, as the wedding photos continued to circulate online, another bombshell dropped. A popular business magazine published an article with the headline, "Robert Hughes, the quiet mogul behind the country's largest restaurant empire." The article was a detailed profile of Robert's rise to power, describing how he had gone from a dishwasher to one of the most successful restaurateurs in the nation. It revealed that Robert had built a chain of gourmet restaurants, each one more successful than the last, and how he had chosen to keep his identity a secret in his own family. The magazine's online platform quickly picked up the story, and within hours it had gone viral. Readers flooded the comment sections with shock and admiration, and social media was ablaze with questions about Robert. How had he stayed hidden for so long? Why had he chosen to work as a waiter at his own son's wedding? The public's fascination grew, and Claire found herself at the center of a storm of online scrutiny. As the story spread, Claire's phone rang non-stop with calls from friends, colleagues, and even distant relatives. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, how they could have missed the truth about Robert. The questions were relentless, and Claire felt like she was suffocating in a sea of embarrassment. Every call made her feel smaller, more exposed. Her initial disbelief at the article had turned into a deep, painful regret. David, still reeling from the news, sat beside her in silence. He had no idea how to process the truth about his father's identity, nor how to deal with the fallout from his wife's behavior. Claire's face was flushed, her eyes wide with shock as she read the comments and tweets flooding in. The world was discovering Robert's true worth, and there was nothing Claire could do to undo the damage she had caused by dismissing him as just a waiter. The article not only highlighted Robert's business achievements, but also praised his quiet generosity and dedication to the communities where his restaurants were located. It described how he had made significant donations to food programs for the needy and employed older workers, providing them with second chances. Robert's image as a humble, generous man who had built his empire with hard work and compassion resonated deeply with readers, elevating him beyond the business world into a symbol of integrity. Claire couldn't escape the irony. She had spent so much time pushing Robert into the background, unaware that he was not just a man she could ignore. He was the very foundation of the luxury she had taken for granted. As the news spread, she could feel the eyes of her friends and family on her, each one silently judging her for the way she had treated Robert. The revelation wasn't just about Robert's wealth. It was about the deeper truth he had always embodied. That real value was in one's character, not outward appearances. While Claire's world seemed to be falling apart, Robert continued to live as he always had, quietly, with dignity. He had nothing to prove, and now everyone would finally see who he truly was. The phone didn't stop ringing. Claire stared at the screen in disbelief, her hand trembling as she held it to her ear. On the other end, a voice she hadn't heard in years, her old college friend, asked the same question everyone else had been asking. Is it true? Is the waiter from the wedding really Robert Hughes, the billionaire behind that restaurant empire? Claire's mouth went dry as she nodded mechanically, though she couldn't bring herself to speak. Her entire world felt like it was crumbling around her. David sat across from her, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the coffee table. He had seen the article, heard the rumors, but hearing the confirmation from Claire, his wife's stunned silence, made it all feel real. "I don't understand," he muttered, rubbing his temples. "How could we not know? How could I not know?" His voice cracked as he looked at Claire, the betrayal in his eyes as much toward her as toward himself. Claire felt her world shift beneath her feet. Her once perfect life, built on the foundation of appearances, had shattered. Everyone she knew, friends, family, acquaintances, was suddenly more interested in Robert than in her. The barrage of phone calls only intensified as more people wanted to confirm if the waiter who had served at their wedding was truly the man behind an empire. Claire had always prided herself on knowing the right people, but now she felt like a stranger in her own life. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years pretending to be someone she wasn't, building an image of success and wealth, and now the one person she had underestimated, the one she had pushed aside, was the very one who had silently built an empire. Robert's quiet strength had been the true power in their family, and Claire had failed to recognize it. The guilt gnawed at her, sinking deeper with every call, every message that came through. David, unable to take the silence any longer, stood up and paced the room. "We need to fix this. We have to talk to him," he said, his voice filled with urgency. Claire stood up as well, her legs shaky. She didn't know what to say, how to make amends for the hurtful things she had said. She had always considered herself superior, someone with a vision, someone who could manipulate situations to her advantage. But now, it was clear she had no control. Robert had kept his silence for so long, and it was that very silence that had exposed her. As the day passed, the shock of the revelation began to sink deeper into their family. Some relatives tried to act normal, but their eyes were filled with disbelief and curiosity. They began to look at Claire differently, some even with pity. Her reputation, built on appearances, now seemed fragile and hollow. Meanwhile, David could no longer ignore the weight of his father's quiet presence in their lives. His heart ached as he realized just how little he had truly known about the man who had raised him. Finally, Claire couldn't take it anymore. She picked up the phone, her fingers trembling, and dialed Robert's number. The line rang, and as it connected, she hesitated. What could she possibly say to him now? The words she had once spoken, dismissive, cruel, echoed in her mind. She had treated him like an outsider, someone beneath her. And now, all she could do was wait for him to answer, knowing that whatever happened next would forever change their relationship. Claire's hands were shaking as she dialed Robert's number, her heart racing with each passing second. The phone rang, a steady reminder of the weight of her actions. She had no idea what she would say when he answered, but she knew one thing: she had to explain herself. The guilt from her earlier actions pressed heavily on her chest, and the weight of the world seemed to rest on this one call. When the line finally connected, Claire's voice wavered, trying to maintain some semblance of control. "Robert," she began, her voice cracking slightly, I need to talk to you. I owe you an apology." There was a long pause on the other end, and Claire braced herself for what was to come. "I didn't know," she continued, her words tumbling out. "I thought you were just a waiter. I never knew who you really were. I didn't mean to treat you like that. I was wrong. So wrong." Robert's calm voice came through the phone, steady and unshaken. "What you thought about me," he said simply, "never changed who I am." His words were measured, devoid of anger, but the weight of his truth hung heavily in the air. Claire felt her chest tighten, and she almost wished he had shouted, shown some kind of emotion. But Robert's quiet strength was far more powerful than any outburst. He wasn't asking for her forgiveness. He was offering her a lesson in humility. "I thought you were someone else," Claire murmured, barely able to look at herself in the mirror. She had seen Robert through a lens of superiority, believing that his life's work was beneath her, beneath the image she had carefully cultivated. "I never took the time to see you for who you really are," she continued, her voice faltering. "I've always been so focused on my own world that I failed to see the value in yours." Robert remained silent for a moment, as if considering her words carefully. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, but no less resolute. "Claire, it's not about your world or mine. It's about seeing people for who they truly are, beyond the surface. I've spent my life building something real. And when I chose to stay in the background tonight, it was because I didn't want to force anyone to see me. I didn't need them to. What matters is that I've always been true to myself." Claire's eyes filled with tears as she listened to Robert's calm response. She had expected anger, frustration, perhaps even condemnation, but instead she was met with a quiet strength that left her feeling small in comparison. "I'm sorry, Robert," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I never understood. I thought I could control everything, make everything fit into my perfect life, but I was wrong." Robert's voice softened even further, though still with the same quiet dignity. "You don't need to apologize for not knowing," he said, "but you do need to understand that respect isn't earned by titles or appearances. It's earned by what we do when no one is watching. I've worked my whole life for something real, and that's what you should have seen. Not the uniform, not the role I played, but the person behind it." Claire sat in silence, the weight of his words settling heavily upon her. She realized, too late, that Robert had always been more than she ever imagined. After the confrontation, Robert continued his life just as he had before, quietly and with dignity. Even with the public revelation of his success, he chose to maintain the same routine. He still worked nights in his restaurants, not out of necessity, but because he found peace in the kitchen among his staff. It wasn't about money, it was about the work. Every evening, he would walk through the kitchens, checking on his staff, giving advice, and ensuring the quality of every dish. He did it all with a calm focus, as though it was simply a part of who he was, not a task that needed recognition. Despite his immense wealth, Robert never sought the spotlight. He found joy in the small moments, the smiles of his employees, the satisfaction of a perfectly prepared dish, the simple satisfaction of work well done. To him, it wasn't about proving his success to anyone. It was about staying true to himself. The world could call him whatever it wished, but Robert had learned long ago that the only opinion that mattered was his own. He was at peace with his life, and that was enough. Even when he went back to work at the weddings and private events, it wasn't for show. He took pride in being present with his team, serving with the same humility he had always embodied. He never expected gratitude or praise. He gave it freely, offering advice, helping in the kitchen, and cleaning up without hesitation. The staff knew he was more than just a boss. They respected him not because of his title, but because he had worked beside them, just as he always had. Robert's respect for others never wavered, no matter their position. He spoke to everyone with kindness, from the dishwashers to the chefs, from the waitstaff to the janitors. There was no hierarchy in his eyes. Everyone played a vital role in creating the experience for the guests, and Robert treated each person with the same level of importance. Claire, however, was unable to fully comprehend the depth of this humility. She continued to watch from the sidelines, struggling with the realization that the man she had mocked was the one who had shown her the true meaning of respect. Weeks passed, and Claire found herself visiting Robert's restaurant more often, but not as a guest. She began to notice the way he interacted with everyone, the warmth in his voice when he spoke to his staff, the sincerity in his actions. She had always thought of him as an accessory to her life, a figure to be tolerated. But now she saw the depth of his character and felt a rising sense of guilt that she couldn't shake. Robert never mentioned the past. He continued to greet her with the same respect, as though nothing had ever happened. One evening, as Claire walked into the restaurant, Robert saw her across the room. She was standing in front of the menu, lost in thought. He walked over to her and with a kind smile said, "The lamb tonight is particularly good, Claire. I'd recommend it." She nodded, stunned by the simplicity of his words and the absence of resentment. Robert wasn't angry with her. He never had been. He had already forgiven her, not for her benefit, but for his own peace. Later, as Claire sat down to her meal, she couldn't help but reflect on everything she had learned from Robert in these quiet, humbling moments. He had never needed to prove anything. His humility spoke louder than any title, any material possession, or any public recognition. And now, as she sat alone in the restaurant, she realized that the lesson she needed to learn had been right in front of her all along. True greatness is not defined by what we have, but by how we treat others, no matter their place in the world. For Robert, true wealth had never been about money. It was about something deeper, something far more meaningful. His legacy of hard work, integrity, and dignity. He had spent his life building not just a business empire, but a foundation of respect and character. Every restaurant he owned, every staff member he hired, every decision he made was grounded in the belief that success wasn't defined by how much you earned, but by how you treated others. Money, in the end, was just a tool, a means to an end. He looked around his restaurant one evening, watching his team work in harmony. The kitchen buzzed with activity as dishes were prepared with precision, while waiters moved fluidly between the tables, ensuring each guest was satisfied. Robert felt a deep sense of pride. This was his true wealth, a family of workers who had built something together, not through luxury or shortcuts, but through sweat, dedication, and mutual respect. It was the kind of wealth that could never be measured in numbers or bank statements. Robert had often turned down lucrative offers to sell his business. Many had approached him over the years, offering vast sums of money, eager to buy his chain of restaurants. But he always refused. He knew that selling out wouldn't bring him happiness. His fulfillment came from the relationships he had built, the trust he had earned from his staff, and the knowledge that he had created something lasting, a place where people could find not just a meal, but a sense of belonging. His family, on the other hand, had never fully understood this perspective. Claire, with her desire for status and wealth, could never see the value in the things that Robert held most dear. To her, the money and the appearance of success were everything. She had built her life on the superficial, and only now, after the revelation of Robert's true identity, did she begin to see the emptiness of that pursuit. She had chased the wrong things for too long, And now she realized the man she had once dismissed had something far more valuable than anything money could buy. Robert, however, never sought to prove anything to Claire or to anyone else. He had always known that his worth wasn't tied to the opinions of others. He didn't need validation. His actions, his work, and his values spoke for themselves. The quiet dignity with which he had lived his life was a far greater reward than any accolades or recognition. He had earned the respect of those who truly mattered, and that, in his mind, was worth more than all the riches in the world. As time passed, Robert's legacy began to take shape not only through his business, but through the countless people he had touched over the years. Many of his employees had risen to positions of leadership in his company, and some had gone on to start their own successful ventures, inspired by his work ethic and his belief in second chances. Robert's influence was far-reaching, not because of the wealth he had amassed, but because of the principles he had instilled in those around him. Claire, still grappling with the weight of her own ignorance, began to understand what Robert had meant all along. As she watched him work alongside his staff, treating everyone with the same respect, she saw the true value of what he had built. It wasn't about the cars, the mansions, or the prestige. It was about the lives he had touched, the people he had empowered, and the quiet legacy he had created. For the first time, Claire began to see Robert not as the waiter she had once dismissed, but as the man who had achieved something far more profound than she could ever understand, a life of true wealth grounded in respect and purpose. As the years went by, Robert's name became more and more well-known, not just in the restaurant industry, but across the country. His quiet success, built on years of dedication and hard work, had finally earned the recognition it deserved. But Robert never sought the spotlight, and even as his restaurants continued to thrive, he remained humble, working behind the scenes to ensure his legacy would live on in the hearts of those who had been touched by his kindness. Late one evening, as he sat in his small office at the back of one of his restaurants, Robert pulled out a worn leather notebook. The pages were yellowed with age, and the ink was fading, but the words he had written were as clear as ever. He had always kept a journal, documenting his thoughts, the lessons he had learned, and the moments of quiet reflection that had shaped his life. It was in this journal that he had poured out his soul, and it was where he would leave his final words. With a pen in his hand, Robert wrote one last entry, his handwriting steady despite his age. Some see a waiter, others a magnate. I only wish to be remembered as someone who served, and I don't mean just food. He paused for a moment, his mind filled with memories of the years he had spent building something that truly mattered. He had never wanted to be seen as a businessman or a wealthy mogul. His goal had always been to serve others, serve his community, and serve with humility. Robert's life had not been about accumulating wealth or accolades. It had been about the quiet moments of service, the ability to offer help when needed, and the strength to stand tall without ever needing to prove himself to anyone. He had always understood that the true measure of a person's life was not in their material possessions or their public image, but in the way they treated others, especially when no one was watching. As he closed the notebook, Robert felt a sense of peace. He had lived a life true to his values, and now, with the weight of his years behind him, he was content. The world had seen him as many things, just a waiter, a businessman, a magnate. But Robert knew the truth. He had never sought to be anyone other than himself. He had never needed anyone's approval, because he had built a life that was meaningful, one that could not be measured in money or fame. In his final days, Robert spent his time visiting his restaurants, checking in on the staff, and ensuring that the values he had instilled in his business continued to thrive. He knew that his legacy would live on through the people he had mentored, the employees he had helped, and the lives he had touched. He didn't need a monument or a public memorial. His legacy was in the hearts of those who had worked alongside him, who had shared in his vision, and who had learned the true meaning of success through his example. As Robert passed peacefully in his sleep one evening, surrounded by the warmth of his legacy, he left behind more than just a successful business. He left behind a message that would echo for generations. True wealth is not measured by what we possess, but by what we give and how we treat others. And in the end, Robert Hughes was remembered as the man who served not just food, but humanity itself.